1 Peter chapter 4, verse 1, it says this, "Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude. Because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. For you have spent enough time in the past doing what the pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. They are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless, wild living and they heap abuse upon you, but they will have to give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead." Every year growing up, my family would take me on vacation. Our whole family would go, and we would take extended family with us, and oftentimes friends. This was something we did since I was in diapers, and we would go up to Trinity Lake. I know some of you have been up there before. I know some people in the church like Trinity Lake, but we would go up there. This is a picture of me and my family there. My mom loves to surf, and so she has to get this picture of us every year. This was a long time ago. I don't know how long ago it was, but my little brother's a lot bigger than that now. But we would go every year, and it was one of my favorite parts. We'd spend like 2 weeks up there, up in the dirt. We would tent camp. There were no RVs in our household. It was tents and air mattresses, and then a lot of red dirt. That's kind of how Trinity Lake was. But we loved it. We really grew to love it. And we had this little area on the campground, and it was like our spot. Every year we would rent out the same spot, and there was this loop, and it was kind of like our loop with a bunch of campsites, and when family would come out, we would rent them spots in that loop. So it was kind of like our area. And after going there for many, many years, I mean, this was probably 15 or 16 years into it, we really started to feel like we owned the place. It was our lake. It was our campsite. And there was one year in particular when this group came. And this was the first year and the last year that we went over 4th of July weekend. But there was this group came from Weaverville, California. And if you saw them, they looked like they came from Weaverville, California. And they were coming in, and the Eagles is just like blasting through the lifted truck. And they're setting up camp, and they're already like drinking their beer. And we're finishing up dinner. And our routine in our little campsite is, we would finish up dinner. We'd sit around the fire. Sometimes we'd play a board game. And then we'd go to bed because it's a long day out on the lake at Trinity, and we're usually like pooped. But we're realizing as we're finishing up dinner, doing our dishes, that it's going to be a long night because these people are just getting started. And they're drinking more, and they're getting louder, and it's dark at this point. And we're sitting around the campfire, and we were all kind of sour. We were all kind of upset. Like, how dare they come to our lake and make this noise at our campsite? And we were all like kind of feeling like really upset. And there was like this collective attitude problem and this sourness in our campsite. And we're sitting around the fire, and none of us were enjoying it that night. Usually that's like the nicest part of the night, but we're just sitting there upset. And then my little brother, he goes and he grabs one of the BB guns. He's like, "I'll take care of this." And he was joking, but we're like, haha, very funny. But that'd be really funny, if you shot one of them from the bushes, and that would quiet them down, right? Or maybe like hit their lantern or shoot their keg or something like that. And it was just kind of like a joke, and we didn't think much of it. And so we decided, all right, well, they're not getting any quieter. Let's just try to go to bed. So we go into our tents, and if you've ever slept in a tent before, there's like zero noise blocking ability with that little fabric. And so we're just kind of laying there trying to fall asleep. But then as I'm like, just laying there, I hear my brother unzip his tent. You can hear everything, right? And I hear my brother unzip his tent. And I can hear him and his friend go in the back of the truck, and I know exactly what they're doing. They're getting the BB gun. And so they go and they get the BB gun, and now I'm interested. Like, what are they going to do? Are they going to shoot the lantern? Or are they going to, who knows? And so I kind of hear this happening. So now I'm kind of like standing up in my tent, just kind of like listening and kind of wishing it was me, but also like very happy that I didn't have the courage to do this. And so he grabs the BB gun. I hear him kind of running over to the side next to where their camp was. And then he loads it, and his friend, they're like giggling, and they think this is so funny. And then he pumps it, and he pumps it, and he like 8 pumps this thing. I'm like, oh my gosh, he's going to like blow up a lantern. And so he like 8 pumps this BB gun, and then you just hear, pah, and then you hear them just kind of run away. They run, they go back into their tent, and I'll remember this moment. This was like the last pleasant moment of the night, if it was even a pleasant moment. And you kind of look back at like crazy situations, and you remember like the turning point, and you remember like when everything went wrong, and it was kind of right there in that moment. I look back at what kind of led up to that moment before everything went nuts. And when I look at what caused all this, and it was a collective thing. I can put a lot of blame on my brother, but it was a collective thing. We had an attitude problem. Like us in the camp, me, my brother, my parents, my friends, my family, all of us, we had this attitude problem of entitlement, honestly. We felt like, man, we've been coming here, we own this place. And that really led to some severe consequences because of what happened, because of what we did, because really it started here, though. It wasn't just the action that he did. It was the mindset that we had going into this. And as we go through this passage in 1 Peter, I want to talk about mindset. I want to talk about attitude because when it comes to making changes in life, when it comes to making progress, when it comes to being a better person, when it comes to serving the Lord and changing a lot of actions that need to change in our lives, we can't get caught focusing on what we do. That's what we see. And the consequences come from what we do, but what we do comes from what we think. It comes from our attitude, and it starts here. And so it's really important to start there. In the very first verse here in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 1 says, "Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude." This passage starts off with this command to arm yourself with an attitude. We're going to see a list of do's and a list of don'ts later on in 1 Peter. We're going to see all the things that we shouldn't be doing as Christians. But Peter doesn't start with the list. Peter first starts with the mind. He says, look, we're going to get to that stuff, all the things you shouldn't be doing. But in order to address that, in order to make changes, in order to make progress in your life, we can't start just with the do's and don'ts. We have to start with how we think. Because all of our actions come from here. And that order is set up at the beginning of this passage here as Peter starts first and foremost with the mind. Starts with our attitude, our mindset. The next part of verse 1, it's kind of interesting. He says, "Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin." That sounds nice. To be done with sin. Is that possible? Whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. How? We see a little bit more of this in verse 2. It says, "As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God." When I hear that, I think of Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus knew. He went into Jerusalem, and he knew that as he entered the city, that this was the beginning of his end. He knew he was going to die there. He knew that the religious leaders were fed up with him. He knew that it was at a point where there was a plot to kill him, and he knew. A couple of weeks ago, I asked the question, what would you do if you knew you had one day left to live? It wasn't a hypothetical question for Jesus. Jesus knew his time was up. He had this last supper, this last dinner with his followers and his friends. He knew he was going to die. He knew he was about to be betrayed. And after dinner, he goes and he prays, and the disciples, he brings them with him. And he's in the garden, and he's praying, and he's telling his disciples to pray with him, because Jesus knows what's about to happen. And the disciples, they're falling asleep, and Jesus keeps saying, "Hey guys, I'm about to die. I need you to pray with me." And they're like, yeah. Like, we'll pray with you. And Jesus goes and he prays. And you know what Jesus prays in the garden? As he knows he's about to die, he knows it's going to be a terrible night, a terrible death. And you know what he prays? You remember the words he says? He says, "Father, take this cup from me. God, I don't want to do this. I don't want to die. But not my will, but yours." We get a peek at Jesus' mindset here, his attitude of not my will, God, but yours. And that was his prayer. And we see Peter calling us to adopt that mindset, to arm ourselves with that attitude of not my will, but yours. That's what it looks like to be done with sin. That's what it looks like to have real change in your life. To start here and to start with a very specific mindset. Peter uses this word, he says in verse 1, he says, arm yourself. And I've got a picture of this word on the screen. It's a Greek word, haplizo. And this actually comes from the Greek word hoplite. If you're familiar with that, that was a term for one of the forms of the Greek foot soldiers. Now the hoplite, I've got a picture of one from a museum. This is on a piece of pottery. And the hoplites were some of the best armed and the best trained of soldiers in ancient Greece. And so if you've ever seen the movie 300, the Spartans, the specific kind of soldier that the Spartan was a hoplite. And so hoplites, they were trained and prepared for battle. They were the best armed, they were the best equipped, and they were the best prepared. But there were multiple different kinds of soldiers in ancient Greece. There were the hoplites who were the best of the best. But oftentimes in times of war, the city-states would call up just a peasant army. They would just get all the villagers and the townspeople and they'd arm them and they'd say, well, look, we have to defend ourselves. We didn't have time to prepare an army. We have to fight and defend ourselves. And there's a scene in the movie 300 where the Spartans, they come in contact with another group of men who are going to fight with them against the Persians. And the Spartans, the leader, he says, what do you do for a living? He's talking to the other army that's about to join them. And he says, well, I'm a potter. And then he talks to the other one and he says, what do you do for a living? He says, oh, I'm a farmer. And then the king turns to his Spartans and he says, Spartans, what do you do for a living? And they all go, haru, haru, and they do like this soldier thing. And basically the point he was making was that like, you have your job and you're also a soldier, and that's great, but our job is to be soldiers. And in the movie you see that, right? Like they're the best of the best. But I want to bring this into our Christian faith. What would it look like when we step into difficult circumstances, when we step into trying times, when we're trying to make changes in our lives? What would it look like to be prepared and proactive instead of reactive? You have these two different kinds of armies in ancient Greece. You have the ones that are trained and equipped and prepared. But that takes advance notice, right? That takes years of training before the battle. And then you have the other soldiers who just pick up a weapon and join the fight. The reactionary. When you face your difficult, your trials, your circumstances, are you reactive or are you proactive? Oftentimes, we're really good at being reactive. We look at an area where we've screwed up and we say, man, I messed that up. I really went off on my coworker. Or I said some things I didn't mean to my wife. Or I did something that I really regret. I want to make a change. And we're really good at looking back and being reactive. But how can we be proactive? How can we step into these situations prepared for that fight, knowing where our weaknesses are? Where are those areas where you tend to screw up? Where are those areas you look back and you say, man, I have a history of messing up in this spot or in this area or in this relationship? Maybe instead of going into that and doing damage control after we've failed, what happens if we prepare for battle? What happens if we say, okay, I'm going to go see my mother-in-law. I need to pray for patience leading up to this. I'm going to go see my mother-in-law. I need to make sure that I'm going to expect that I'm going to be annoyed. So I'm going to prepare for that. Or what if we went into work and we said, you know what? I know my boss is going to be mean to me. He's going to degrade me and he doesn't like me. And so I'm going to go in expecting that. And I'm going to look for ways that I can be more forgiving. I can look for ways that I can respond to these frustrating things with kindness. What are those areas where you tend to screw up, where you tend to be tempted, where you tend to not live a Christian life? How can you prepare for those? How can you arm yourself like Peter tells us to? And that's what the passage is getting at. We have to arm ourselves starting here. We have to prepare for a battle, to look at it as if it's a battle. So after my brother did his thing with his friend and they go back into their tent, I'm just kind of listening and kind of waiting to see what happens. I don't really know what happens. I just hear that he 8-pumped this BB gun, shot it, and took off. And so I'm just kind of standing there waiting to see what happens. And they were loud, but all of a sudden the conversation started getting a little more focused, and they started talking about Daryl's bee sting. And then they start to realize it's not a bee sting, and one of the ladies says, Daryl, that's not a bee sting. And all of a sudden the music starts getting quiet. And they turn down the music, and they realize that this dude had been shot by a pellet gun, and it was in his arm. And so they're angry. They're very, very angry. And the tension is just escalating. And so I was chuckling at first, but then when I realized, like, oh my gosh, like these people are drunk and mad, I started to get a little nervous. And they started getting angrier and angrier, and they started yelling. And so I'm standing in my tent, and all of a sudden I'm seeing like flashlights like pass across. If you've ever been in the tent at night, you can see like any kind of light or whatever. And so all of a sudden there's like flashlights like going across our campsite, and I could see it like pointing at my tent, and they're yelling, and they're out for blood. Like they want to kill someone. They're angry, and I'd be angry too. And so they're going around with their flashlights, and they're screaming, and they get to our site, and they're walking through, and they're yelling. And I have never heard so much like rage before in my life. Like these people were going to kill someone. And I'm picturing them going into my brother's tent, dragging him out and killing him. And I'm like standing there like, and I didn't even know what to do. Because if I go out and I try and like calm them down, well then like I'm making myself a target. Like it'd be better if they thought we were all just asleep. And I literally, I don't know if you've ever had this, but I'm like just paralyzed. Just like, I don't know what to do. I'm not sure how to handle this. And they make it through our campsite. They go on to the next one, and they're screaming and they're yelling, and they're just looking for anyone, anything. And after they had gone a certain distance away, I got out of my tent, and I saw that my brother and his friend and my dad, and we all kind of got out of our tents. We're like, what are we going to do? Do we just leave? And like we all knew that what my brother did, and we all knew that like this one was on us. And so we knew that we kind of bared the responsibility. And so we're like, I don't know what we're going to do at this point. And these people, they're drunk, and they're running around, and they're angry. And we were all really stressed out. But then there was my brother. And my brother's standing there, and he's like, guys, it's fine. I prayed. And we're like, dude, like, you put us in this situation. He's like, guys, I prayed. It's fine. And then we see the flashlight starting to come back. So we're like, okay, look, and my dad was like, guys, just go to sleep. Like, we'll deal with this tomorrow. Just go to sleep. And I remember going back into my tent, and I remember laying down and being like, I'm going to go to sleep. I'm going to try and sleep. And all the while, there's just people yelling and screaming all around the camp. And at one point, my dad ended up going out because they started confronting like some person that was out just throwing their garbage away. And my dad goes out, and he's like, what's going on, guys? And they're like, we're looking for someone who shot Daryl. And Daryl had some like a bruise on his arm at this point. And my dad's like, well, that's crazy. Was it like what'd they shoot him with? Like a bow and arrow? And they're like, no, we think it was a pellet gun. And he's like, oh man, that's terrifying. There's someone out here, hunting us with a pellet gun. And he's like trying to talk him down. And eventually the people, they ended up just leaving that night. They were just gone. They were kind of fed up with it, and they left. And we didn't know until the next morning because we woke up and they were just gone. And it was one of the most like terrifying experiences to like know that happened and that like I was a part of it. But then I look at everything like at the end. Like we had this list of things that we did, right? Like you could probably call that assault, like if he shot him with a BB gun. And then like he like lied about it. And then like he went and threw the BB gun away later. And so like destruction of evidence. And so I look at like my brother and what my group was responsible for that night. And we have like a long list of sins, right? And we definitely, we were a Christian group in that campground, and we didn't look like it, right? I mean, fortunately, they didn't know that was us. I don't know what would have happened if they would have known it was us, but we didn't look like a Christian group. Like now that you know my dirty little secret, we don't look like Christians. That's not a very Christian way to behave at a campground, but we did it. And I look at that long list of sins that we committed, and I ask why? Why did that happen? And it all goes back to us sitting around at that fire, feeling entitled, feeling like, how dare they impose on us? Us not having the patience and the forgiveness and the willingness to suffer. I mean, they were just loud. It's not that big of a deal. But we had such an attitude that we weren't willing to put up with that. It all starts here. And it seems like it's no big deal, right? It's like, oh, it's just a bad attitude. It's just a mindset, and maybe I'm not in a good mood. But man, that can escalate quickly. And hopefully most times it won't lead to you shooting someone with a BB gun. But oftentimes it could lead to words that you say that you regret. Or sometimes your mindset can lead to things that you do that you can't undo. See, the stuff that starts here can have some serious consequences. But so often when we're looking to make changes in our life, we don't start here. We start with our actions. right? We start by saying, well, I don't want to cuss anymore, so I'm just going to stop cussing. And we don't think, man, maybe I need to start adjusting what's going on in my mind. Maybe I need to start adjusting what I'm taking in, the kind of shows that I'm watching or music that I'm listening to. And we get so focused on what we're going to do, we don't stop to think of where that comes from. How can we make adjustments starting here? Because if we really want to see change in what we do, in our actions, we have to start with our thoughts. We have to start with our mindset. Peter goes on in the passage, and he says in verse 3, "For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do." And then he lists off all those sins. But then he closes in verse 5, and he says this, "But they will have to give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead." This passage shows us two kinds of people. There are those who are done with sin, those who've adopted the mindset of Jesus, and they said, I'm going to follow Jesus. And then there are those who aren't done with sin. There are those who live according to their own passions and desires. And we see these two kinds of people juxtaposed. And we see Peter saying, look, adopt the mindset of Christ so you can live like Christ. But he knows his audience, and his audience, that, and we do this too, we tend to live for ourselves. But to be done with sin. Romans 12:2 says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Real change starts there with the mind. I'm going to invite the band up. And there's this closing part of 1 Peter chapter 5. It's near the end of the passage, and I want to read this over you. And I want to challenge you to be thinking of those areas where you tend to struggle. Those areas where historically you've looked back and you said, man, I've screwed this up a few times. I haven't honored God very well in this part of my life. And I want you to look at that, and I want you to be thinking of how you can prepare yourself for those situations. Maybe when you get in the car, you can say, I'm going to intentionally be more generous. I'm going to keep some cash in my pocket just in case I see a homeless person. I'm going to be prepared for this situation. When I get home today from a long day of work, I know that my mood is going to be bad. And so I'm going to spend some time in the car decompressing and praying before I go in and see my kids, before I go and see my wife. Because I know I tend to be snappy when I get home from work. Where are those areas where you fail? How can you prepare? How can you arm yourself with the right mindset? So I want to invite you to stand right now, and I'm going to read the closing of this passage, and I want to read it over you. And so if you feel comfortable, I want to invite you to just place your palms up like this. This is a posture of receiving. And I would encourage you to, as I read this, to receive this benediction. Would you close your eyes? The end of all things is near. Therefore, be alert and of sober mind so that you may pray. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. If anyone speaks, they should do so as one who speaks the very words of God. If anyone serves, they should do so with the strength God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To him be the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen.